Israel says that it has the right to defend itself against any aggression. What are the implications of the recent attacks, not only between the two sides, but in the region as well?
I agree that Israel, like any state, has a right to defend itself, but that's not what international law says. And in fact, in general, in international law, no country has the right to defend itself by force unless they've exhausted peaceful means. Has Israel exhausted peaceful means? No. In fact, it knows exactly how to stop rocket attacks. I don't think the region's likely to get involved, frankly. First of all, everyone's afraid of the United States, and it's just too dangerous for others to get involved, just as they didn't get involved in cast lead. So as long as the U.S. participates in the attacks, as it is doing, it's not standing outside looking. It's providing the arms, it's providing the diplomatic support, so it's a direct participant. And as long as that's happening, the world isn't going to get involved, just as the world didn't get involved in the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
And how would you assess the timing of these attacks?
Well, first of all, they go on constantly. I mean, Israel and the U.S. are constantly attacking Gaza. A state of siege is an act of war, and the U.S. and Israel have maintained a constant siege. It really took off in January 2006, interestingly. I mean, it was plenty bad before, but January 2006, it escalated. The reason was there was a free election in Palestine, and people voted the wrong way, and that has to be punished. So instantly, the U.S. And Israel, with the European Union following along, initiated harsh punishment of the population. The U.S. also instituted another policy, which is normal when a population votes the wrong way. Organize a military coup to overthrow the government. That's routine. And immediately the U.S. began to organize a military coup. It's supposed to be led by the Khan, Fatah strongman. Well, the government preempted the coup. That's a major crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election, but to block a U.S.-run military coup that's planning to overthrow the government, and now we're off in major criminality. So the siege got far more intense, much more brutal, a lot of violence and so on, and it essentially continues without a stop. And there's fluctuations, so like cast lead was the worst part. And since then there's been a kind of a truce. And if Israel wanted, and the U.S. wanted to stop the Qassam missiles, they know how to do it. Reinstitute the truce. Hamas repeatedly called for a truce, called for it again a couple of days before the killing of Jabari, the main issue. And Israel recognizes officially that during the very few months when Israel abided by the truce, there were no rockets. So they could reinstitute it if they wanted to defend themselves. But given the fact that there are peaceful means, they're perfectly available, there's no justification in international law for use of force. And if there is, you have to appeal to the Security Council.
So as we said earlier, Israel says that it has the right to defend itself against ongoing rocket attacks from militants coming from Gaza. And this recent assault was merely to provide security for its population. How effective is this strategy in advancing its long-term interests and providing security?
It's not, providing security is not a high concern for Israel or other states. In fact, if you go back to 1971, Israel made a fundamental decision, crucial. It had a choice between security and expansion. What happened in 1971 is that President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for withdrawal from the occupied territories, and in fact he only cared about the Sinai. Peace treaty with Israel with Egypt gives Israel a security in the international system. There was no Palestinian issue then. So that they could have essentially full security. They debated it, decided to reject it, preferred to expand at that time into the Sinai. And as always, the question is, what's the U.S. going to do? There was a split inside the U.S. Nixon administration. State Department wanted to accept the peace treaty. Henry Kissinger opposed it. He called for what he called stalemate, no negotiations, just force. So with Kissinger's backing, Israel rejected it. And since that time, that's essentially what led to the '73 war. Since that time, Israel and the U.S. have consistently rejected security in favor of expansion. And that's what's going on right now. Gaza's totally occupied. You know, it's sea, land, air, obviously. It's a prison. The West Bank, U.S. and Israel are essentially taking over what they want. All of this is illegal. It's all criminal. But as long as the U.S. backs it and participates in it, it'll continue. And it has nothing to do with security. I mean, take, say, the wall in the West Bank, which is called the security wall. There's nothing at all to do with security. If Israel was concerned about security, it would have built the wall on the international border. Then they could make it, you know, a mile high, tanks patrolling on both sides, totally impenetrable, and so on. But if they had done it there, it would have inconvenienced illegal Israeli settlers. So they built it somewhere where it would inconvenience, in fact, harm Palestinians. But the issue is not security. And in fact, Israel is not alone in this respect. For great powers, major powers, even small ones, the security of the population is not usually a high priority. There are other interests, power interests, and so on. So you talk about security, of course, but if you take a look, rarely. I mean, even take, say, fear of terror. Take the invasion of Iraq again. We're supposed to be fighting a war on terror. Every intelligence agency, including the CIA, informed the Bush administration that invading Iraq was very likely to increase the threat of terror, which in fact it did, way beyond what they expected. But that wasn't a consideration. I mean, terrorist attacks against the population, okay, live with them. What we want is power and profit.
That's very true. Professor Chomsky, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
My name is Chris Hedges. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. And because I'm an Arabic speaker, I spent most of my time in the occupied territories, especially in Gaza. Because the Israelis can't do anything without the acquiescence of the U.S. government. And the moment that there's enough popular support against the war crimes that are being committed against the population in Gaza, that is probably the most effective mechanism to make the abuse and suffering of the Gazans end. As long as the United States government refuses to prohibit or permits the Israeli government to continue this form of collective punishment and abuse, it will continue. And the moment the American government finally demands a halt to it, it will halt. Well, because it's a part of a whole kind of, the same thing is happening on a smaller scale in the West Bank, where what they've done is reduce Palestinians to living in surrounded ghettos, in essence, about 8 of them on the West Bank. When you take a map and you look at the ring roads and how they connect up with Jewish settlements and the closed military areas, you find 8 pod-like structures that in an instant can be cut off, and often are cut off by the Israeli military. You just have a larger ghetto in Gaza itself. And the object is to reduce Palestinians to a subsistence level. Most Palestinians are now living on about $2 a day, a kind of Africanization of the Palestinians. And that is the Israeli tactic, one, to encourage ethnic cleansing, to push people out. Much of the middle class has now already left the West Bank. Much of the middle class left Gaza a while ago. And those that remain live in such dire poverty that daily existence becomes such a struggle that they are essentially broken. Their resistance, their capacity to resist is broken. That's the policy. You know, I'm a great supporter of nonviolent resistance, and I think that the flotillas to Gaza are a perfect example of sort of shaming the Israelis for the crimes that they are committing, bringing attention to the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza to the rest of the world in a nonviolent and a peaceful way. And for that, I think, you know, if we just keep battering against that door, if we just have the kind of resolve to be persistent over time, I think that Israel has become such a pariah state that its policies against the Palestinians are becoming known and denounced by even many people who would be defined as Israeli supporters in the United States, that moral force is on our side. And if we are steadfast in our efforts, I believe we can have a significant effect. Well, you can't get aid into Gaza. That's the problem. We can raise all sorts of money, and the Israelis won't let it in. There's a blockade. And I think that aid is important, of course, but as any Palestinian will tell you, the power of these flotillas and of active resistance on the part of people outside Gaza is extremely important. I'm not pretending that it's more important than food, but I think it gives many Palestinians the heart to keep going, to know that they're not alone, to know that we stand with them. So yes, they are incredibly expensive, but even if we turned all this money over to medical and food supplies, the Israelis wouldn't let it in. I mean, that's just been a persistent policy. So that's really, finally, not even an option. You know, these flotillas are just copying what Jewish refugees were doing to the British. It's exactly the same tactic, and it was a pretty effective tactic then, and I think it's a pretty effective tactic now. It is, does it impact on the Israelis? Of course. Look at the Israeli response to the Turkish ships, and the reaction not only in Turkey but throughout the world at large. Over it exposed the brutality of the Israeli occupation to those people that hadn't been closely monitoring what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. And I think it really came home to the wider world at large. So, sure, I think that it empowers or gives a kind of support to those elements within Israel, and I lived in Jerusalem, that are there, that would also like to see justice. And I think that the more that we are able to act, the more that we are able to, in nonviolent means, use our bodies to illustrate the injustices that are being committed, the more the power of the Israeli government erodes.